In this episode of our Alternative History Documentaries, we'll be covering the Treaty of Vienna, which was the peace agreement ending one of the deadliest wars in human history. The Great War began on March 26, 1915, when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Serbia had recently lost the Balkan War against the Ottoman Empire, and the Austrians sought to seize Serbian lands before the Turks were able to occupy the entire country. The Austrian-Hungarian army failed in their objective, and instead their actions served as the first slight against the Ottoman Sultan, and also gave the Russians the excuse they needed to declare war on the Central Powers. France honored their alliance to Russia, and when Germany immediately declared war on Belgium, the United Kingdom quickly joined the war as well. The Ottoman Empire would later join the Central Powers, while Japan, Portugal, the United States, and several other countries eventually joined the Triple Entente. The war would continue for over 5 years, resulting in 10.33 million military casualties on the Entente side, while the Central Powers suffered 6.05 million military casualties, for a total of 6.38 million. That's not counting the tens of millions of civilian casualties suffered on both sides. By the spring of 1920, both the Central Powers and the Entente desperately desired an end to the conflict. The Entente powers were clearly losing the war. Russia had made a separate peace after the outbreak of the Russian Revolution and Civil War. France and Belgium had capitulated, then were occupied by the Turkish and German armies. Most of Africa was in the hands of the Central Powers, and the Entente failed at invasion after invasion to liberate their conquered allies. The Central Powers, on the other hand, reveled in their victories in Europe and Africa, but their non-existent navy ensured that they lacked the capacity to knock Britain and America out of the war. When peace talks began in March 1920, there were many obstacles to overcome. The Central Powers believed that they had won a decisive victory, while the British and Americans sat safely behind their control of the seas, knowing there was little else their enemy could do against them. The United Kingdom wanted to return to the balance of power on the continent, refusing to discuss any territory changes in Europe. They were only willing to give up colonies in Africa. The Americans sought to end imperialism, which they believed played a key role in the outbreak of the war, and offered to grant independence to the Philippines if the other European powers agreed to free their colonies in Africa and Asia. The American President, Woodrow Wilson, also argued for the creation of a General Association of Nations to be formed in order to deal with future territorial disputes without resorting to war, and to ensure the independence of all nations, big and small. France, Belgium, Portugal, and Japan were all invited to the peace conference. However, they were largely ignored in the ongoing negotiations, which caused a great deal of animosity amongst the Entente powers. The relationship between the three Central Powers was in an even worse situation. The degradation of the alliance began in the fall of 1917, when Kaiser Wilhelm, as the faction leader, made peace with Russia without even consulting with the Austrians or Turks. Russia was defeated largely due to the efforts of Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans, yet the peace treaty only granted land to Germany, while also granting the independence of several countries. Austria-Hungary had wanted possession of Ukraine rather than their freedom, and the Ottoman Sultan desired control of Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. Therefore, Germany had lost the trust of its allies. The first obstacle to peace was deciding where the conference would be held. Germany, as the head of the alliance and due to their central location, felt the conference should be held in their country. However, Sultan Mehmed viewed Turkey, perhaps rightfully so, as the saviors of the Central Powers. He contended that the conference should be held in Constantinople. After weeks of disagreement, it was eventually decided that the peace conference would be held in Vienna due to its location in between German and Ottoman territory. The Vienna Peace Conference began April 3, 1920. The Central Powers blamed Russia and France for the war and maintained that Russia would have never declared war if it wasn't for French encouragement. The Central Powers sought to impose harsh terms on France in retribution. One of their non-negotiable terms was that France had to be stripped of all her overseas colonies. The Entente states felt this to be too harsh a term, and the US absolutely refused to allow Germany to occupy French territories in the Western Hemisphere. Furthermore, Germany demanded control of French border areas to protect against future aggression, and Austria sought control over Corsica. After weeks of debate, an agreement regarding French territories had finally been made. France would lose all her African and Asian possessions, but would retain control over colonies in the Americas. The Entente agreed to Austria-Hungary gaining Corsica, but staunchly refused German demands for control over borderlands in France. Instead, Germany was given control over Luxembourg, and the French border states were declared demilitarized zones. Similar deals were done regarding Portugal and Belgium. Both were required to surrender their colonies in Africa and Asia. Since neither Austria nor the Ottomans had interest in Asia, Germany took possession of the colonies there, including French Indochina, the Portuguese and French ports in India and China, and several French islands in the Pacific. The Americans were deeply concerned with the increase of German power in the Pacific, and thus part of the agreement was for the US to take possession of some of the French islands, as well as for Germany to give up several islands further east, including the Marshall Islands. The French, Belgian, and Portuguese leaders were furious when they heard the terms to be imposed on them, declaring the Brits and Americans to be appeasing cowards. The French president, Armand Fallières, stormed out of the conference, returning to France the next day. In the last month of the conference, the enemy powers haggled over British colonies. The Central Powers originally tried to push the same deal given to the French, that they would surrender all colonies in Africa and Asia. The British ardently refused, instead offering to hand over all colonies in Africa and the Middle East while retaining their lands in Asia. The Turks and Austria-Hungary were willing to accept this, but Germany outright refused. It was only when a sulking Wilhelm walked out of the talks that the British leaders agreed to give Germany North Borneo. Africa was split between the three Central Powers. Austria-Hungary gained French West Africa, Senegal, Sierra Leone, and Nigeria, while Germany would have full control over South Africa, the Congo, and Madagascar. The Ottoman Empire was the greatest benefactor in this area, gaining Egypt, the Sudan, Somaliland, Tunisia, Algiers, and Morocco. The Ottomans were also given control over the British colonies in the Middle East, notably Oman and Kuwait. The two final points dealt with in the treaty were the Royal Navy's presence in the Mediterranean and Russia. The Central Powers had faced Entente naval invasions throughout the war and insisted that British naval power in the Mediterranean be greatly reduced. The Austrians demanded Gibraltar, while the Turks sought Cyprus and Malta. Once again, the British fervently refused to deal, but after US insistence, the Brits offered to give up Cyprus and Malta, while still refusing to hand over Gibraltar. The Ottomans took possession of Cyprus and the Austrians gained Malta, a point that the Sultan was quite unpleased with. Britain was considerably concerned about the ongoing revolution and civil war in Russia. They sought to work into the peace deal an agreement to create a coalition to intervene in the war in order to help the whites. Germany was open to such a coalition as they were quite alarmed by the communist revolution as well. However, the Austrians and Turks refused to join the coalition unless they would gain the Ukrainian and Russian territories they desired. This was something neither Germany nor Britain would agree to. The US by this point had tired of the conference. The other powers had largely ignored their proposal for the creation of an international association, and it was clear that imperialism in Africa and Asia would not come to an end. The US had also suffered from over 1 million casualties in the war, hence America also refused to join in the war against Russia. After 3 months of intense negotiations, the Treaty of Vienna was finally signed on June 30th, 1920. A new world emerged from amongst the ashes of the Great War. As Britain and Germany prepared for an offensive against the communist rebels in Russia, it was readily apparent that this would not be the war to end all wars. In fact, it seemed the world was more divided than ever before. The victorious Central Powers disbanded their alliance shortly after the treaty was signed. The Ottoman Sultan, who was in command of one of the most disciplined and experienced armies the world had seen, was upset with the terms of the treaty. With his armies assembling on the Austrian, Russian, and Romanian borders, would the Turks soon go back to war? The French, Portuguese, and Belgian people were vehemently against the treaty and the way that they had been treated at the conference. So-called treaty revisionists began preaching in the streets of Paris, calling for the French people to stand up against the injustices of the Treaty of Vienna. Japan had suffered 182,000 casualties in the war, and they still fought on the Eastern Front against the Soviet forces, yet they had generally been excluded from the negotiations. The Japanese military began to voice radical views regarding Japan's place in the world, some arguing that there would never be a better time for Japanese expansion in Asia. And Germany, a country with no navy that had exhausted its manpower reserves, now had to find a way to manage a large colonial empire. We here at the Alt History Institute hope you enjoyed this documentary about the 1920 Treaty of Vienna. It should now be clear to you that the Vienna Treaty had created more issues than it had solved. If you enjoyed this presentation, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the Institute's channel for more alt historical documentaries. Stay tuned for the next episode in this series, where we'll be covering the alt history of the years 1920 through 1936, which has now come to be called the interwar period.